There are voices that entertain, and then there are voices that make people feel, for a few minutes at least, that the world is exactly as warm and generous as they always hoped it might be. Michael Bublé has one of those voices, the kind that floats through a speaker and reaches something deep in the chest, something that had almost gone quiet, something most people had stopped expecting to feel from music at all. Millions of people know that voice. They know it from No Ill albums playing in kitchens in December. They know it from Haven't Met You Yet on wedding dance floors. They know it from crooning standards that belonged to another era but somehow sounded completely alive coming from him. The voice felt timeless in the truest sense, not old-fashioned, not nostalgic for the sake of nostalgia, but rooted, honest, built on something real. And the real story, though, was never only in the music. Behind that voice was a decade of invisible work. Behind that ease was years of uncertainty that would have broken most people. And behind every sold-out arena was a quiet, unassuming man who never fully believed the applause was truly for him, until the moment someone reminded him exactly where it had all begun. But that moment was still many years away in the late 1980s, when a small boy in Burnaby, British Columbia, first discovered that music was not something you simply listened to. It was something you lived inside. The house Michael Bublé grew up in was not unusual in any grand sense. His father, Louis Bublé, worked in the fishing industry. His mother, Amber, raised three children in a working-class neighborhood where dreams were treated with a kind of affectionate practicality. You could want things, but you also had to be ready to work for them, and then work harder still when the wanting was not enough on its own. Music was everywhere in the family, not formal, not academic, just present, the way air is present. Louis played guitar. Amber sang around the house. Music was the language the family used when ordinary words fell short, which, in most families, is more often than anyone admits. But it was not his parents who ignited something irreversible in young Michael. It was his grandfather. Mitch Santaga was a plumber by trade and a romantic by temperament. He loved the great American standards the way only a certain kind of person can love them, not as cultural artifacts, not as historical curiosities, but as living emotional documents. He loved Frank Sinatra with the quiet devotion of someone who understood what Sinatra was actually doing, not just performing songs, but inhabiting them, becoming the emotional truth of every lyric, until the music and the man became indistinguishable from each other. Mitch would play his records in the evenings, and young Michael would sit and listen with the concentrated stillness of a child who has found the precise thing he was built for. There was a particular quality to those evenings that Michael would describe much later with a kind of reverence, the warmth of a room lit by lamplight, the scratch and hiss of a record player needle finding its groove, Sinatra's voice coming through the speakers like something from a better, more graceful world, and his grandfather sitting nearby, not explaining anything, not teaching anything in any formal sense, just being present as if the music itself was sufficient instruction. It was, by the time Michael was 13, he was not just listening to those songs, he was singing them, not for an audience, not for approval, but because they had become the vocabulary through which he understood himself. When he sang That's Life or Fly Me to the Moon, he was not impersonating Sinatra, he was borrowing a language to say something that he did not yet have the words for on his own, and there was something no one around him fully understood yet. What looked like a hobby was actually a calling. What looked like a teenager imitating his grandfather's taste was actually the slow formation of an identity that would eventually reshape the musical landscape of an entire generation. The music industry in the 1990s was not waiting for Michael Bublé. It was waiting for boy bands with synchronized choreography and stadium-engineered hooks. It was waiting for electronic production, for artists who fit cleanly into a demographic bracket, for music that could be described in 3 words to a marketing executive and immediately understood. It was waiting, in short, for the exact opposite of a 20-year-old from Burnaby who wanted to sing swing standards and big band arrangements and the kind of music that most label executives had mentally filed away under the single word: irrelevant. Michael was not naive about this. He understood that his taste was out of step with the moment. But understanding a problem and being able to solve it are entirely different things, and for years he lived in the uncomfortable space between those two realities. He performed wherever he could. Wedding receptions, corporate events, small clubs where the audience was largely indifferent, where conversations continued uninterrupted through his sets, where the applause at the end was polite rather than felt. He sang for people who had not come to see him in rooms that had not been designed for music, and he found a way to do it night after night without letting the indifference hollow him out. That is harder than it sounds. There is a particular kind of erosion that comes from performing to rooms that do not respond. Not rejection exactly. Rejection at least acknowledges that something was attempted. This was more like invisibility, showing up completely, voice and presence and intention fully present, and watching it pass through people without leaving a mark. And yet, the real story was never about whether the audience was ready, it was about whether Michael was. He kept singing not because success was visible on the horizon, but because stopping felt like a different kind of failure, the failure of abandoning the only thing that had ever made complete sense to him. His grandfather had not taught him that music was a career path. He had taught him, without ever saying it directly, that music was a form of truth, and you do not stop telling the truth simply because no one is listening yet. But there were moments, quiet, private, honest moments that no performance could disguise, when he wondered if the industry's sustained silence was simply the world's careful way of telling him something he was not yet prepared to hear. He was in his early 20s, playing his fourth wedding reception of the month, earning enough to keep the lights on and not much more, when the thought arrived fully formed. Maybe this is all it will ever be? He pushed it away, but it came back. It always came back, and the meaning of that recurring doubt would only become clear much later. Mitch Santaga was watching all of this from a grandfather's vantage point, which is to say, he saw things that Michael could not see about himself. He saw the talent with clear eyes, unclouded by either false hope or the protective caution that fear produces. He heard something in his grandson's voice that was not merely good, not merely impressive for a young man from a working-class neighborhood in British Columbia, but genuinely exceptional, the kind of exceptional that does not come from practice alone, the kind that arrives already formed and simply needs a door to walk through. The problem was the door. Mitch did not have industry connections. He did not have relationships at record labels or friendships with producers or knowledge of how the machinery of commercial music actually worked. He had what he had always had, a plumber's savings accumulated over decades of honest work, an unwavering belief in his grandson that had never required external validation, and the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that something must be done and then simply sets about doing it regardless of obstacles. He emptied a portion of those savings and paid for studio time, not demo tape time in the back of a small facility on a Tuesday afternoon, real studio time, the kind where the engineers actually listen, where the acoustics are designed for fidelity rather than efficiency, where a voice can fill the room the way it was always meant to fill it. Michael walked into that studio and recorded a collection of standards, Sinatra songs, big band arrangements, the music he had been singing since he was a teenager sitting still in his grandfather's living room, now captured on tape with the clarity and space it had always deserved. The demo existed because an old man with a plumber's savings had decided, quietly and without announcement, that his grandson deserved to be heard by the world. What happened next would define the following 2 decades, but no one in that studio on that day could have known what they were actually setting in motion. The demo changed hands in the way that things change hands in the music industry, through patience and persistence and the particular geography of being in the right room at the right time, without necessarily knowing that was what was happening. Connections led to connections. The tape moved through informal channels, and eventually through a chain of circumstances too improbable to have been engineered deliberately, it reached someone who had spent decades recognizing exactly the kind of voice it contained. David Foster was one of the most celebrated record producers in the world. He had shaped the careers of Celine Dion, Whitney Houston, Barbra Streisand, and a generation of artists whose voices had become part of the cultural infrastructure of modern life. He was not someone who needed to discover new talent. He had earned the right to be selective, and selective was, if anything, an understatement. There were always demos. There were always young singers with genuine ability who nonetheless lacked whatever ineffable quality separated talent from phenomenon. Foster had heard enough of them to maintain appropriate skepticism about the next one. He pressed play on the Bublé demo. What happened in that moment Foster would later describe with the careful language of someone trying to articulate something that fundamentally resists articulation. He heard a voice, but more than the voice itself, he heard something behind the voice. A quality of presence, of emotional intelligence, of understanding what a song actually needed, and then providing exactly that. Not performing, not executing a technical requirement, understanding. This was not a young man doing Sinatra. This was a young man who had absorbed everything Sinatra represented and was now speaking that language as naturally as his mother tongue. The fluency was complete, the authenticity was total. Foster picked up the phone, and this phone call was the moment everything changed, though Michael, in a small apartment far from Foster's world, did not yet know it. Michael Bublé was 27 years old when the record deal materialized through Foster's involvement. He had been performing professionally for nearly a decade. He had sung at more wedding receptions and corporate events than he could accurately count. He had sat with uncertainty long enough that its weight had become familiar, a permanent companion rather than a temporary obstacle that would eventually be removed. The door was finally open. But here is the thing about doors that open after you have spent years standing in front of closed ones. You do not walk through them lightly. You walk through them carrying everything that accumulated while they were shut. All the nights in small clubs, all the polite applause from rooms of strangers who hadn't come to hear him, all the quiet moments of self-questioning that arrived, uninvited, at 2 in the morning when the performance was over and the silence had nothing to fill it. His self-titled debut album, shaped by Foster's guidance and built entirely on Michael's deep fluency in the American standards tradition, arrived in February 2003. It was not by the commercial logic of the moment, the kind of record that was supposed to connect with a mass audience. Big band arrangements, swing tempos, songs written decades before most of the potential listeners were born. The industry had told him as much for years with varying degrees of directness. And yet the album reached the top 5 in Canada, it charted in the United States, it charted in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in countries where a young man from Burnaby singing Frank Sinatra songs had no logical right to find any audience at all. But the real story was never about logic. The audience that found Michael Bublé in 2003 was an audience that had been waiting for something it could not have named. They had been surrounded by music engineered for efficiency, sounds designed to be consumed quickly and forgotten, replaced by the next sound before the previous one had fully registered. And then this voice arrived, warm, spacious, emotionally present, technically refined without being cold, modern without being disposable. It felt like something that had always been true, suddenly being said aloud in a room full of people who had been thinking it quietly for years. The smoothness of the voice, though, did not mean the path had been effortless. What the audience heard as ease was actually a decade of invisible labor, and what came next would test something even deeper. Success arrived not gradually, but in accumulating waves, each one larger and more unexpected than the last. Crazy Love in 2009 debuted at number 1 in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia simultaneously, an achievement that artists with far longer careers could not claim. The Christmas albums became their own category of cultural phenomenon, finding their way into homes that did not otherwise own a single Bublé record, but could not imagine December without his voice drifting through the kitchen on a cold afternoon. The image that accompanied this success, the tuxedos, the knowing smiles, the effortless stage presence, the way he moved through a song as though it cost him nothing, could be read and was occasionally read as surface, as a man who had found a brand and was executing it with calculated precision. Some critics wrote exactly this, with varying degrees of generosity. What they missed was where the music actually came from. When Michael Bublé sang about longing, he was not performing an emotion he had calculated would land with an audience. He was reaching back into something specific and real, the late nights in small clubs, the gap between what he had and what he was reaching toward, the particular quality of hope that survives repeated disappointment not by diminishing, but by deepening into something more durable and more honest. The standards he sang were not nostalgic ornaments applied to a contemporary surface. They were emotional blueprints that articulated things he had felt so precisely that he had built his entire artistic identity around their architecture. The charm was genuine, so was the vulnerability underneath it, and the combination of the two, warmth that did not collapse into sentiment, confidence that did not calcify into arrogance, was what made audiences feel not merely entertained but genuinely held. That is a rarer quality than it appears. It had come from somewhere specific. It had come from a record collection in Burnaby and a boy who listened, and from a decade of performing in rooms that required him to reach toward people rather than wait for them to come to him. The applause filling those arenas was real, and so was the silence that had preceded it for so long. Both things were true simultaneously. Both things shaped the voice. There is a particular challenge that comes with being known primarily as a performer of other people's songs. The Great American Standards tradition is precisely that, a tradition, a body of work created by composers and lyricists who are now mostly historical figures. Michael Bublé did not write Cry Me a River or The Way You Look Tonight. He interpreted them, and interpretation is not a lesser act than composition. It requires a different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of understanding what a song is actually about beneath its surface, of bringing something true and specific from your own life to bear on material created from someone else's experience, of making the gap between the original and the interpretation invisible to the listener. This was exactly what Mitch Santaga had modeled, without ever naming it, in those Burnaby evenings. The old man had not analyzed Sinatra. He had simply loved the music with complete attention, had allowed it to become part of how he understood the world, and in doing so had demonstrated to his grandson that interpretation was itself a form of truth-telling. Michael had absorbed that lesson at a cellular level. When he sang a song, any song, he was not presenting it at arm's length. He was living inside it for 3 minutes, finding the corners of the lyric where his own life had left marks, and allowing those marks to shape the sound in ways the audience could feel without necessarily being able to name. This was why the Christmas albums hit something deeper than seasonal sentiment. This was why love songs written in the 1940s moved audiences born 60 years after the ink dried. The music held something real, and the real thing inside it was not nostalgia exactly, it was the recognition of emotions that are genuinely timeless because human beings have always felt them and have always needed language precise enough to hold them. Michael Bublé provided that language borrowed from another era, spoken in a voice unmistakably of the present. But there was something beneath the music that most of the audience never fully saw. Something that would only reveal itself when the life behind the voice was tested in ways that no amount of craft could prepare a person for. The awards accumulated, the sold-out tours, the platinum certifications on multiple continents, the Grammy nominations, and the critical reassessments from writers who had initially dismissed him as a novelty and then found themselves unable to explain away the consistency and emotional depth of his catalog over more than a decade, the cultural permanence that most artists never achieve and cannot engineer no matter how strategically they position themselves. And through all of it, Michael Bublé held on to a knowledge that had nothing to do with commercial success and everything to do with where the music had actually come from. Mitch Santaga had lived to see his grandson become famous, had sat in audience after audience watching people respond to a voice he had recognized decades before the industry was prepared to, had watched the music he had introduced in a Burnaby living room travel around the world and return to him as something larger than either of them had imagined when they sat together on those quiet evenings. There is a particular quality to that kind of witness. Not pride exactly, though pride was certainly present. Something quieter, like watching a thing you believed in before anyone else believed in it finally reveal itself to the world, and feeling not vindicated, but simply grateful. Grateful that you had trusted the thing when it was only a seed. Grateful that the seed had grown into something that gave other people warmth. Mitch passed away in 2011. Michael was in the middle of one of the most professionally successful periods of his career. The Christmas album that would sell millions of copies was completed that same year. He was surrounded by the fullness of everything his grandfather had helped set in motion, and his grandfather was gone. He handled it the way he handled most of the important private things in his life, with discretion, with the understanding that the most important things are not necessarily the most visible things, and with the knowledge that the best tribute he could offer was not words but continued and deepened work. When he sang at his concerts in the months and years that followed, something subtle shifted in how he inhabited the standards. A new layer had settled into the interpretation, a quality of dedication that had always been there but now carried additional weight, the weight of a conversation that could no longer be completed in person. Every Sinatra song became a private exchange with the man who had first played it for him. Every packed arena was evidence offered to no one who could receive it directly. that an old plumber's faith in a boy from Burnaby had not been misplaced. Fame is a complicated country to live in, and most people who achieve it do not navigate it gracefully. Michael Bublé navigated it with more grace than most. He maintained an identity that felt consistent across the years of success, self-deprecating in the way of someone genuinely comfortable with who they are, rather than performing humility as a calculated strategy against public overexposure. He married Argentine actress Luisana Lopilato in 2011. He became a father. He spoke in interviews about family not as a brand positioning, but as the actual organizing principle of how he understood his life and his purpose within it. The story changed most profoundly in 2016, when his son Noah was diagnosed with liver cancer. Michael did not address the press with carefully managed language. He did not release a statement designed to control the narrative. He simply stepped away, stopped touring, stopped recording, pulled back entirely from the public life he had spent 20 years building, because there was something more important than any of it, and that something had become suddenly, terribly, undeniably clear. The world that had given him everything could wait, his son could not. This is where the real Michael Bublé became visible in its fullest form. Not on a stage, not in a recording studio, not in the photographs from sold-out arenas where tens of thousands of people sang his songs back to him, but in the quiet, private act of choosing presence over performance, choosing the irreducibly real over the professionally constructed, choosing a child over a career, without hesitation and without calculation. He had learned from his grandfather, not through any explicit lesson, but through years of simple proximity, that the people you love are the reason for everything else, that the music matters because people matter, that the voice filling a room means nothing without the people in the room who are genuinely listening. When Noah's cancer eventually went into remission, Michael returned to music carrying that knowledge more completely than before. He returned not as a performer reclaiming a career that had been briefly interrupted, but as a man who now understood more precisely what he was actually singing about in every song he had ever recorded. The stage was the same, the voice was the same, but the man standing at the microphone had been somewhere that changed what the music meant, and the audience could feel it, even those who did not know the story behind it. There is a version of the Michael Bublé story that begins with David Foster and a record deal and a debut album in the winter of 2003. That version is accurate as far as it goes. It contains the facts, it describes the trajectory, it accounts for the commercial success and the cultural impact and the awards and the sold-out tours and the Christmas albums that became part of how an entire generation marked the passage of December. But the real story begins earlier. It begins in a living room in Burnaby, British Columbia, with a plumber's record collection and a boy who sat still and listened without being told to. It begins with Frank Sinatra's voice coming through old speakers and landing on a child who was already, without knowing the word for it, a musician. It begins with Mitch Santaga deciding one afternoon that his savings were less important than his grandson's voice, and that the world had not yet heard something it needed to hear. That decision, quiet, private, made without any expectation of return or recognition, changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Without that studio time, the demo does not exist. Without the demo, David Foster does not receive it. Without Foster, the record deal does not happen. Without the record deal, millions of people's Decembers are slightly less warm, slightly less musical, slightly less illuminated by a voice that made the world feel like it still contained beauty worth noticing. The entire cathedral was built on that foundation, and the foundation was one man's faith. Michael Bublé has spoken about his grandfather in terms that resist easy quotation, because the feeling behind the words is larger than the words themselves can hold. He is described being taught not merely to love music, but to take it seriously as a form of truth-telling. He has described those evenings in the Burnaby living room as the most important education he ever received. And he has spoken quietly about the weight of knowing that every night, in every arena, in every December kitchen where his voice changes the quality of the air, all of it traces back to a man who could not be there to see it. The audience hears a voice, they feel something warm and specific and hard to fully name. They call it timeless, which is their way of saying it comes from somewhere real rather than somewhere manufactured. They are right, it does. It comes from Burnaby, British Columbia, from a record collection and a plumber's savings and a completely unqualified belief in something beautiful before the world had agreed to acknowledge that beauty. It comes from a boy who listened with his whole attention, And it comes from a grandfather who understood without needing it articulated that some gifts cannot be given with objects or money or instruction. They can only be given with time and presence and the quiet, unhurried act of saying, through attention rather than words, that you believe in what someone is reaching toward, that you have always believed in it, that you will still believe in it tomorrow. That was the gift Mitch Santaga gave. A demo tape paid for with a plumber's savings. A door held open by love. The voice was Michael's, the belief was Mitch's, and the music belonged to anyone who needed it. Anyone who pressed play on a cold evening and felt the room grow warmer without understanding exactly why. Anyone who heard those songs and remembered, for a few minutes, that the world was capable of grace. The demo almost never existed. Everything that followed almost never happened. And the reason any of it did was an old man who decided one afternoon that some things were worth spending everything you had saved. He was right. He was completely, absolutely, irreversibly right. And Michael Bublé has spent his entire career proving it. One song, one evening, one packed and grateful arena at a time.